I'm Jay Geisler. I'm a Pittsburgh priest. Some people refer to me as Father Jay, some as Dr. Jay, some as Pastor Jay, but I am Jay, and I am a recovering alcoholic and an addict. And I'd like to talk to you about Pittsburgh and what I believe God intends to do with this city. These are holy hills and they're sacred streams. And so I'd like to take a little step back in history to tell you who has recognized that this is a sacred place. One of the first persons to recognize that it was sacred was George Washington. He came to this area. As a matter of fact, he almost lost his life twice in this region. Well, maybe 3 times. Once down at Washington Crossing on the Allegheny River, another time in Jumonville, and then later when Braddock was defeated in the French and Indian War. But he came and saw the point and said, whoever controls this land will control the empire, the Ohio Valley region, which was a battle between the French and also the English, and the Native Americans were in the middle of the battlefield. And he recognized the importance of this. And later on, George Washington was sent here because they were going to build a fort. It wasn't finished down at what we call the Point, and the French came down and they took it over, and he had to retreat. Later, he came up to warn them once again to leave, and there was a battle, a small skirmish in Jumonville, which is right outside of Pittsburgh. And what happened was the man was killed, the French officer, and it led to his first defeat at Fort Necessity, where he surrendered, and he signed a document saying that he had killed this French officer who was a diplomat. Unfortunately, his translator's French wasn't very good, and he said that he had assassinated him. And that led to the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. And Churchill said it was the First World War because it was fought all over the globe. It was fought in India, it was fought in Africa, it was fought in Europe, it was fought in North America, it was even fought in the Philippines. And so from the very beginning, this has had a historical significance. Now, having said that, George Washington later came back with Braddock to capture the Point. And it was one of the worst defeats in English military history. They were ambushed near the town of Braddock. And what happened in the town of Braddock is, of course, that they were massacred. George Washington himself had bullet holes through his uniform. And it was Washington who actually led them in retreat. And so not only in his early days did he surrender once, but he also had to retreat. Later on, of course, George Washington would become president. And I want to let you know that on the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed, and then a few days later it made it to New York, George Washington was a rock star. George had recaptured Boston. He had liberated it from the British by getting cannons from Fort Ticonderoga up on the hills, and the British fleet was powerless to attack them, and so they retreated, and he was a superstar in the eyes of the colonists because he had freed Boston. He was also an incredible athlete. He was the best horseman in America, which would be like being a quarterback today and being a star quarterback, like a Brady or a Bradshaw or something like that. And there, when they signed the Declaration, it took a couple days to get it to New York. Now, he would be terribly defeated in New York because the British could just go up and down the rivers, and it turned out to be a disaster. But what happened was they had it read to all the troops. And on that day, what George Washington did is he went into his tent and he penned these words, "On this day," which of course is the reading of the Declaration of Independence, that on this day, my thoughts go back to the banks of the Monongahela, because he said that that's when he knew that Providence, which was his equivalent of a higher power, or God of his own understanding, Providence had delivered him. Years later, after he became president, there was the first rebellion in the United States against the federal government. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion. The Scots-Irish were upset they were going to tax it. Thousands of people actually met at Braddock's Field, and George Washington is the only president to actually lead troops towards battle. And he led them all the way to Bedford, and in Bedford he turned it over to Hamilton, and Hamilton came in, put down the rebellion. But when he was at Bedford, a Native American chief came and talked to him and wanted to meet him, and he said, "Have we ever met before?" And the chief said, "Yes, we have met before." And he said, "Well, I don't remember." He said, "That's because it was on the banks of the Monongahela." And what had happened is, he said, he shot at him over a dozen times, and when he didn't hit him, he realized that the Great Spirit, as the Native Americans often referred to God, wanted him for a purpose, and so he said, "I ordered all the other braves not to shoot at him." So this is one of the stories of Pittsburgh and its origins. And if you leap forward, we were Pennsylvania, the first state to abolish slavery, the gradual abolition of slavery. We were, during the Civil War, we were the arsenal. We had some of the biggest guns ever made, cannons, down in Lawrenceville at the arsenal there. So we played a very important role in that. But I want to specifically talk about 100 years that Pittsburgh changed the world. It made the modern world. 1859. And when I'm talking Pittsburgh, I'm not talking downtown Pittsburgh. I'm talking this economic region, which stretches into western Pennsylvania, a little part of Ohio, and also parts of northern West Virginia. And it goes from Wheeling to up to Butler to Oil City to Kittanning. It goes down to Charleroi. It goes down to Monongahela. This economic area later, during World War II, would produce more steel than the Germans and the Japanese combined. So that's one of the reasons we're not speaking German or Japanese. This community, this hardworking community, and it was the original frontier to the west. Later on, it would be St. Louis. But anyhow, I want to talk about a specific period, 1859 to 1959. And I challenge any city in the world to lay forth this type of history of how it changed the world. And it's God working through people. 1859, Drake discovers oil. And when Drake discovers oil, what happens is, that's going to change everything, because we're now going from coal, which of course Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh was very involved in coal, and it brought in the modern industrial age with oil. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad, and so instead of taking 3 months to cross the country, it now can take a week. But 1 month before it was completed, George Westinghouse had put forth the air brake, and so now they could travel safely instead of men running across the top, manually trying to brake the train in rain and wind through tunnels. It could be done automatically. And so that's one of the achievements. And of course, George Westinghouse goes on to work with AC electricity. And at the 125th anniversary of the country, they light up the Chicago Fair. And at the same time, George Ferris, who had created the Ferris wheel in Pittsburgh as a rival to Eiffel and his later eventual tower, puts out the Eiffel Tower. So Pittsburgh was known. Then you have somebody, for example, like Heinz at that time, Henry Heinz, the mass production of healthy food, ketchup being one of them. Later on, we have, of course, Andrew Carnegie, who at one point is the richest man in the world, who puts his money late in his life into philanthropy. But this area, his Carnegie Steel, which will become U.S. Steel, will produce bridges. It will produce railroads, the rails, and, of course, the I-beam, which is what makes the modern skyscraper. So here's some of the things that were happening here in Pittsburgh. Later, Pittsburgh plate glass, what Pittsburgh plate glass does is that it actually figures out how to make glass in large quantities and larger sheets. Before that, you had to make them hand-blown. Also, aluminum, Aluminum Company of America. If it wasn't for aluminum, we wouldn't have, well, airlines the way we do. So these are some of the things that came out of Pittsburgh. Of course, we had Tesla. Tesla, his inventions will lead to the first commercial radio station. I told you about World War II. We produced all these armaments, all this steel, and north of Pittsburgh in Butler, we have the Jeep, which has become the universal symbol of SUVs. So that's where it was first produced. So you could see this run that they've had here in Pittsburgh. And to kind of end that run, you have the first commercial in the United States, nuclear power plant here down in Shippensburg. And then the one that ends that 100 years is Salk creating the cure for polio. And in 1955, when it became commercially feasible and he got the rights to it, that he did not patent it. He allowed it to go out and be reproduced because he wanted it to be. So there's 100 years where Pittsburgh changed the world. And I believe that the next 100 years, we're already in it, that Pittsburgh will be called a city of recovery. And Sam Shoemaker said in the late 50s, after that 100-year run, he said, the day will come when Pittsburgh is greater for God than it is for steel. As a former steel worker, Pittsburgh is no longer famous for steel. But the other half of that prophecy is coming true. And what I believe is that we have had 3 renaissance, well, 2 and a third one coming. The first renaissance is we recovered from all the industrial pollution. We were the first country to really look at it, the first city. The Denora smog killed people in 1948. Churchill actually used that as an example of the great smog in London in 52. Hey, this stuff can kill you. Then when the steel industry went down, Westinghouse went down, G.C. Murphy's went down in the 70s and 80s, we became a city of economic recovery. The reason that there's Steeler bars all over the United States is that our young people had to flee to get jobs. But now we have become, well, a city of meds and eds, medicine and education, and I will ask, or I will imply, robotics for the future. So I believe that we've had 2 renaissance, 2 recoveries. One of them is recovering from pollution. The other one is recovering from deindustrialization. The whole, everything's going overseas, and we've had to remake ourselves. But the third renaissance will be a renaissance of the spirit. And I believe that Pittsburgh will be a city of recovery. Addiction is rampant, not just in this country. 100,000 people died in a 1-year period during COVID because of overdose, primarily with fentanyl. But it's a problem all over the world. I've been twice to Uganda. I've been to Spain. Addiction is universal. And I believe that Pittsburgh is called to be a city of recovery. And what we are going to do is we are going to lead the world in service, that we recycle people, that we are a place that will make Pittsburgh greater for God than it is for steel. So I believe that's what God is doing for us. And the last thing I will say, Andrew Purvis one time said about ministry, somebody kept saying, my ministry, and he said, aye, your ministry is shite. However, Christ's ministry in you, that's marvelous. I believe that it is God that is making these holy hills and sacred streams. And I believe that in the history of the world, they will look at Pittsburgh as a spiritual center of the United States. If you think of Italy, you've got Rome and Assisi. You think of France, you might think of Paris or think of Lourdes. If you think of Switzerland, you might think of Geneva, or Germany, Wittenberg, or England, Canterbury. But I believe that Pittsburgh is called to be America's spiritual center. And I think it was preordained going all the way back to George Washington. He recognized that Pittsburgh is going to be someplace special. And so I invite you to join with me in making Pittsburgh greater for God than it is for steel. For these are indeed holy hills and sacred streams.